Hello and welcome to our next session of our Always On virtual series. This virtual series is designed to provide you with thought leadership throughout the year and provide a deep dive into the trends that are transforming the way we do business. Each session, Carousel's own Chief Technology Officer, Jason Vieira, will identify the right mix of topics and speakers to advance your IT strategy and enlighten you on hot button issues and industry trends. Today, we are joined by Carousel's Director of Security Solutions, Josh King, who will discuss when prevention fails, leveraging segmentation to contain threats and mitigate risk in the healthcare industry. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. We have provided our speakers' bios in the top left corner of your screen. In that window, we have provided shortcuts to our speakers' social media pages. We encourage you to take a moment and connect with Josh. At the end of today's session, Josh will address your questions. Please use the Q&A function below the presentation to submit any questions you would like to ask our presenter. If you or a colleague are interested in watching some of our previous Always On sessions, the resource window at the bottom right of your screen will direct you to our on-demand learning page where you can stream all of our past sessions. And with that, I will turn it over to Josh.
Okay, thanks, David. Thanks, everyone, for joining. For anyone that joined my session on ransomware last month, welcome back. This session is sort of a natural continuation, right? Last month, we were talking about ransomware and all the steps to prevent it, to keep it out of our environment, to protect our users. But, you know, in this assumption of breach world, we need to assume that at some point, statistically speaking, someone's going to click a thing that they shouldn't. And, you know, one of the myriad of prevention tools that we've invested in is going to fail us, right? So when that happens, what are some of the strategies and methodologies we can use to contain those threats and essentially put our organizations, you know, on a footing to recover quickly? So before we get started, I'd like to just ask a couple questions. Number one, has your organization experienced a ransomware event within the last 2 years? You just take a second to say yes or no, all anonymous, of course. Second there. And then following up from there. Oh, that's great. Great news. Following up from there, how would you rate your organization's level of preparedness in handling a ransomware event, especially for the folks that maybe haven't experienced one yet? Ranging from come at me, bro, to good luck to us all. Because we haven't had an event doesn't mean one's not coming. Second there. Love it. Sounds like a nice mix there. And finally, how would you rate your personal understanding of how ransomware works and how to defend against it? Again, tying back to some of the concepts from last session. Give that another second or two, and then we'll really get started with the content. Always more to learn. That's right. All right, so let's go. So you know, starting off here, right? I always like to start with kind of news and trends. And as today is a bit focused on kind of the healthcare industry. And just as an aside, you know, we have kind of a spin on healthcare today during this session, but I think the beauty of it is, for folks that aren't necessarily in healthcare, is a lot of these concepts, challenges, really apply to any industry, and that's kind of the beauty of some of this content, is that a lot of us are experiencing all these different challenges and vulnerabilities, so that there's a much wider pool of folks to kind of pull fixes from. I mean, I probably almost don't even need to have this slide, but we need to talk about it. It's only common sense if you know it already. Ransomware is kind of the hot button here. It's certainly been increasing in severity over the years. I think the past 6 or so months have seen some very interesting activity across both the healthcare and also the kind of local government, cities and towns, municipalities type. We've certainly seen a huge influx there. One just recently. I mean, most of these news stories are fairly recent. One of them being, Alabama hospital system. Ransomware forcing 3 hospitals to turn away all but the most critical patients. I mean, when we talk about the impact of a significant ransomware outbreak on an organization, I mean, when we talk about the severity of it, I mean, in the healthcare industry, it can be pretty severe, right? If we're turning away active patients, and if you talk about area hospitals, if you go to one hospital and you're being turned away, go to the other area hospital. Well, guess what? That one is also kind of underwater here, and you don't have that ability. So impacts ranging from I'm turning away patients to Wood Ranch Medical. Their systems were encrypted, crown jewels encrypted, patient data. Maybe they got the key, they couldn't afford the key, whatever it was. They didn't have a good data backup strategy. They got hit with ransomware and they couldn't recover. They actually had to shut their doors because all of the data was encrypted and they couldn't get it back. So that's a pretty big deal. Moving on even further, a lot of kind of what we're talking about in some of these ransomware, heists, if you will, is they're looking for the Bitcoin to give you your data back via that encrypted medium. But kind of the side effect of some of these is that data is being exfiltrated to be sold secondarily, excuse me, to make even more money, right? So an interesting kind of statistics from one of the DLP vendors out there, 70% of healthcare data could lead to identity theft. That means majority of that data actually has enough information to fully execute identity thievery, if you will, which is obviously not good because on many levels, right? So now you're affecting the hospital itself and then the patients after the fact. Another one that was somewhat recent, Danish company that does hearing aids. So big deal out there, 95 million-ish in costs, and I think I don't know if they're fully recovered yet, but ongoing impacts 30 to 45 days later. And just think about it, from your personal life. If you have kids or brothers or sisters or relatives that require hearing aid equipment, and they go to the office to kind of get their upgrade or get it for the first time even, and hey, you're supposed to get it at the beginning of the month, but week goes by, not here yet, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Imagine that. This event has essentially affected or impacted the supply of those hearing aids to consumers. So now we're not just affecting the company, we're affecting the users really on a, customers on a personal level here. So again, no shortage of news stories here. I actually frequent a couple sites that kind of post a lot of the different security incidents, and one of them specifically tied to healthcare, and it's very readily updated, unfortunately. This is kind of what we're facing here. If we think about just the industry, a lot of what's happening, what we see happening in healthcare right now is something that's been happening in some of the other areas. IoT is big across all industries, all verticals. The BYOD, et cetera. But in the healthcare industry, obviously medical IoT devices is kind of a huge business right now, and it's only increasing, and it's going to continue to increase. And IoT, medical IoT is very interesting because, we're going to talk about a lot of kind of the threats and how we address them, from a network level, but some of the other concerns with medical IoT devices is the security of the devices themselves and the applications themselves. Never mind just getting them access into the environments and so on. So a lot of these solutions aren't really built with security in mind. Default credentials to do administrative tasks or like the consoles on the different applications. Everyone uses a shared account, and there are certainly reasons for a lot of these things, but they can have ramifications, during an incident. One of the other areas is the adoption of kind of the hybrid cloud model. So, personally myself and what I've been doing a lot of reading on is, healthcare industry really starting to adopt that hybrid cloud methodology. So lots of AWS, Azure, moving workloads into the cloud using more SaaS-based applications, right? So now we're talking about, an influx of different IoT devices on-prem, and then we're talking about, okay, my standard, everything, all my crown jewels, all my systems are in my data center. There's certainly an increase in adoption to that hybrid cloud model. That's kind of true of other areas, as well. I think, early on there was this, cloud is the best, everyone's going to go to it. At the end of the day, I don't think very few people are going to go 100%. I certainly have some customers that have gone 100% in some verticals, but a hybrid cloud is probably going to be the more, predominant there. So that just kind of adds to the trickery when trying to solve this problem across, all of those, different areas. When you think about some of the big names, healthcare aside, like the Equifax, the Sonys, the DNCs, over the last few years, it's really about, persistence. And what do I mean by that? I mean, it's some malicious actors getting the data they need, getting into the environment and just hanging out in that environment for long periods of time, exfiltrating data, going east-west, getting the credentials to access all the crown jewels, and that's eventually leading to some real damage. And that even, ransomware is kind of like the way to get the quick buck in some cases, but, some of the other attacks, maybe those are more dangerous, right? The guys that are low and slow, trying to go in under the radar and really do, damage to the organization. Not that ransomware is not doing damage in this space. From Verizon Breach Report, I think some interesting statistics. 87% of compromises takes minutes to complete. If I think about what that means, I send a user a phishing email, they click on it, it takes them somewhere that involves, download of malware, it runs, I'm now on the command and control. That could take 30 seconds to do, right? So something that can happen very, very quickly. And then on the flip side, it could take months or longer to discover that. 68% of breaches take, months or longer. And in some cases, you yourselves don't uncover them. With ransomware, you know it because it's noisy, it's in your face, it shuts down your machines. But the behind the scenes, the low and slow stuff, you might not know until, FBI calls you up and say, I kind of found some pastes on dark web, you might want to, do some investigation. If I think about some statistics around healthcare, and some of these were a lot higher than even I was expecting. One of the most targeted industries, just no doubt, twice the number of cyber attacks per industries, and a very high rate of insider breaches, which, is serious. Very small number of folks, saying I've had no incidents of any kind, about 6%, which, is kind of not super shocking here. And lots of avoidable incidents, misconfigures in databases and systems and so on. Again, and when we talk about some of the IoT and the systems and, the ease of use, right? You have, nurses and doctors and they're trying to go in and out of systems. You can't layer on, if you layer on too much security and they can't do their job, that's just not going to work either, right? So it's like this delicate balance we're trying to find. Going back to kind of ransomware, 70%-ish, give or take, of ransomware attacks targeting, healthcare industry. If some of these stats are end of 2018. I'd be interested to see at the end of this year, where that number is and where some of the local state municipalities kind of come in, because it's kind of an equal beatdown this year on some of this stuff. The price, the costs of some of this stuff, $400 per patient, and regardless of some of these big name, big name issues and big name breaches and shutdowns and so on, it still can be very much a challenge for folks to be able to do some of that, those preventative measures, either in solutions or, people and effort and so on. So it's just, overall a costly endeavor to get hit with this stuff. So before we get started into segmentation, real quick kind of question here. Does your organization employ any types of segmentation in the environment today without me defining it or anything like that? Is anyone do they already have a segmentation strategy in place? Second. Finally, do you believe your organization's segmentation strategy has put you in a position to withstand a security incident such as a ransomware outbreak? So of that strategy that you have, do you think the strategy is effective enough? Stop or contain, prevent. All right, just another second. Okay, we got a good, close to 50-50 here, so prize there. So if I think about, this concept of I'm already doing segmentation, or, what's the old way of doing segmentation? We really didn't do segmentation. If we take back to ancient times, right, where there was this concept, and oh, by the way, I like to kind of refer to or get kind of an analogy going here of, our network being kind of like an office building or, a hospital. I've got my different VLANs or different rooms or conference rooms, and, my hallways or my cores, and just to kind of help visualize what we're going to talk about here. And kind of the old way was that we'd all be in just one big giant, almost gymnasium, right? There was no multiple VLANs. It was all one big room. Our users, devices, servers, phones, guests, printers, medical devices. It didn't really matter. And during it was easy to do it that way. There was one way in or out, from an internet perspective. And that was just, that was safe, right? That's when we had the stateful firewall and the AV and the anti-spam, and boom, we're good to go. No breaches here, right? Obviously, we know that's much different now. So if we, kind of fast forward to today, what's a flat network of today almost? And if we think about it again, under that kind of visual of an office, right? So we have, that front end firewall against the internet. We'll consider that our lobby, right? That's where we focus most of our security when we talk about like physical, like there might be a guard there might be a check-in depending on the type of facility, and you have to go through that, that front door in order to get in. And then we kind of have this, once we're inside the facility, inside that castle, you can kind of go between, the different rooms. So like if we're saying that each of these rooms has users and so on in it, they can get up from their seats and they can just go out into the hallway, find an open door, and sit down or talk to any of these other users. And that's kind of what VLAN segmentation is today, right? So the VLANs they logically group the users together, but it's not really a security control because there's nothing stopping me from traversing one VLAN to another, right? And if I think about what that means, there are hundreds of thousands or hundreds of thousands of connections on my network at any one time, east, west, north, south, and this kind of other concept of once I'm inside, again, that castle, not only can I go east, west between my rooms, but a lot of times I have full access to go to the internet as well. There's not a lot of filtering in place there. And so when I'm thinking about kind of flat networks, that's really what I'm thinking of. You might have 100 VLANs, but if there's no security control at that VLAN edge, to me, that's still a flat network, right? So what's the problem with that? It's very from an ease of use, from a user perspective, a device perspective, obviously it's beneficial, right? Because there's nothing to stop me from going into my VLANs. But if we bring it back to a ransomware medium, in the old days, if you get ransomware, it's more of annoyance. The old days of 2013, you get ransomware, and it's kind of your one machine gets hit, and it's annoying, and you go to IT, and they reimage it, and cool. NSA tool hack, WannaCry. Now if you click on the button, that one user infects all other users in that VLAN, looks for servers, looks for other, essentially just goes across that hallway, finds every room with every device that's susceptible, and takes down those devices. And that's why we see these big, in the news, we see entire environments being taken down. Maersk Shipping, City of Atlanta. One user clicked on a thing and then it rapidly encrypted not just the entire user networks, but the server networks, to go with them. It's because there was no kind of point of demarcation that said, hey, oh, nope, stop, you can't go here. Everything was just VLAN related. There was nothing stopping it, right? All right, so I think what I'm trying to say here is that we need to adopt a measure of secure segmentation, and I think depending on where you're reading about this concept, zero trust comes to mind as well. It's this concept of, need to know. I only want you to access the users and devices and applications that you need to access. And there's, this concept is different if I'm on data center side or if I'm on the edge side, right? So let's kind of take this through a little bit. So there's some challenges with adopting a segmentation strategy. Number one is, how about just a lack of infrastructure to support? And we're going to talk through some of the details of these, is that my infrastructure plays a huge, huge role with segmentation. And it means that my infrastructure needs to support certain features and capabilities in order for me to get the most featureful segmentation use cases executed. Limited visibility or understanding of the environment. So even if I understand my infrastructure, do I have a good understanding of the types of users, the devices, the different branches and applications? And that's not always true. There's a lot of folks in the organization that are onboarding devices, medical devices, phones, just a whole bit. Obviously, there's just a myriad of device types. So let's say we actually are thinking we're going down the segmentation path. We create the different VLANs. And we're like, okay, great. I'm expanding this out. I have an IoT segment. I have a PCI segment. I have, general user segment, IP phones, et cetera. How about just getting the users and devices into those defined segments? How do I make that happen seamlessly, right? Without having 100 help desk tickets that involve VLAN changes. How about just the design complexity of segmenting, right? So here I am talking about VLANs, right? Well, how many do I need? You start, kind of drawing this out, and you really want to do segmentation. I don't know that it's more secure to have 100 VLANs, right? Because the management complexity certain increases when I go down that path, right? So the effect that some of these problems have is, number one, whenever you do segmentation anywhere in the environment, I need to build an application dependency mapping, meaning who's the source, who's the destination, what users and devices need to talk to what servers, applications, or what have you. So how do I know what that picture is, right, without the visibility? More often than not, we want to do some measure of automation to get this to happen. We mentioned management complexity going up as a result of segmentation. There's a measure of complexity when I'm introducing tools to do some of that automation, as well. Some of the struggles, you do your diligence, you create the VLANs, maybe you get the devices into the segments, and when you stop short of doing full enforcement because you're gun shy, you're not sure that you've got everything, so you don't actually pull the trigger on that enforcement, right? So you don't actually graduate to enforcement mode because you don't want to have the help desk calls. Because if you go too soon, I didn't make my application dependency mapping wasn't as solid. I now have all these help desk calls. I'm whitelisting in the policy, and now I've got the Swiss cheese firewall effect, that we can sometimes have on the internet perimeter, right? So it's almost we're better off not doing it at all at that point. So there's some challenges and struggles there, but there's some huge benefits to a segmentation strategy, both on the edge and in the data center. The big one is slowing down attackers, right? So I want to eliminate the threat. It's really more limit than eliminate, because eliminate is maybe too absolute of a word. But I want to limit the threat of lateral spread, because that's exactly what ransomware does. You click, one user clicks on a thing, it goes to 10 users, to 100, to 1,000, and so on, right? Because every user device that gets infected then tries to ping out to all other devices, and you've got this kind of cascading effect, right? So by leveraging segmentation, I can almost contain that bad stuff before the bad stuff is even there. One of my favorites, compensating controls. So how do I protect vulnerable assets, when patching isn't an option? There are some devices, there are a lot of applications, servers, et cetera, that I have to run regardless of how old they are, and if I can't patch them, that just is what it is. So segmentation or zero trust style helps me to kind of close some of those gaps and input enforcement points that help me do some virtual patching, and we're going to talk about some of that in a second. I mentioned, policy of least privilege. That's, again, zero trust, need to know. I'm enhancing my visibility in the environment, right? So in order to do the segmentation itself and do enforcement, I need to understand my environment. I can't do that without visibility. So now I'm going to have a measure of visibility that I did not have before. Reduction of attack surface. This is, again, it doesn't matter what endpoint we're talking, right? Every IP address, every device, TCP IP stack, 65,535 ports. Sometimes those ports might be needed for something. Sometimes they're open and they really shouldn't be. So by taking this approach, you have the ability to reduce that overall attack surface across the board, which is a great thing. So when someone's trying to go east-west or spread malware, we have the ability to close some of those gaps. And it really improves our incident response capabilities as well, because if the segmentation is going to be in play before an incident occurs, so you're already going to have limited access, and we're going to talk more about this, but because the enforcement points are already there, that means if a bad thing happens, you're already limited, and now my enforcement points are in play for me to go, oh, quarantine. I don't have to think about, well, where should I block this user? Should I go to the switch? Should I look for them? Should I shut down the port? What if they, unplug and go to a different port? That kind of whole bit. Right, so lots of benefits here. So let's kind of talk through that visually a little bit when I think in macro and micro segmentation. So from a macro level, we're really already doing a measure of macro in all of our networks. It's really our next-gen firewall at our internet edge, right? We're protecting internal users and servers from the internet. That's a macro-based firewall, protecting one group from another group, right? So it's got a default deny on the outside, right? We've got that door locked. I think that trick is many of us still have that permit any from the inside. It's still an open door. Once you're inside, you can kind of do what you want. The benefit of some of the technology that we have at our disposal today from a next-gen firewall is, intrusion prevention and antivirus, anti-malware type of services, right? So malware, ransomware, all that bad stuff is born out of vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities in software, we're talking about patching. What if I can't patch? An IPS is essentially a giant database of vulnerabilities that I'm looking for, that are looking to be exploited. And then I have my AV, which is looking for the actual malware that's being used to do the exploitation, right? So wherever I put this firewall, I now have a concentration of inspection looking for those types of things. In addition to, URL filtering, reputation service, just intense logging capabilities, again, which helps us with visibility. There's probably some room for improvement, right? We want to change it. We want to lock that door on the inside if we can. We want to leverage inspection policies for as much as we can. I do see a lot of customers with next-gen firewalls in play, maybe not fully taking advantage of some of the feature set. So we want to take advantage of that as much as we can. Do some outbound filtering. Geo-blocking an IP reputation. If you don't do overseas work, then maybe there are certain types of access that we can deny out of the gate. Or maybe it's just, maybe it's not outbound, maybe it's more inbound. If I only have patients that access it from, certain areas, again, just low-hanging fruit. Your environment's best. But let's, take a look and take advantage of some of those things. Another one for more of a containment and incident response capability, pre-build blacklists, right? If I see an incident occurring in my network, how much work do I have to do? How much brain power do I have to use in order to just go into my firewall and block that from an exfil? Like, what direction should I write the rule? Where does it need to go? Do I need to put it inbound and outbound? If you pre-build some of that stuff, it's kind of a quick, you add the IP, add it to the group, done. Something like that. So it's all about speed. And same with integration with AD. Again, incident response. How much information can I get with the least number of clicks? If I go into my firewall, I'm not AD integrated, I don't have usernames there. Now I've got to go somewhere else to find that username, right, and further track it down. So keeping it going, what about protecting our critical assets with that same kind of methodology, that macro-based segmentation, right? So how about just putting a next-gen firewall in front of our server environment? So this is something we've been seeing a lot more of as well, with the next-gen firewalls having a lot more speeds and feeds and features and performance and kind of virtualization capabilities, putting that next-gen firewall between my users and my servers. So again, we're talking about using those inspection profiles of those features that we talked about, closing unneeded ports that I don't need, right? And that's helping me limit the lateral spread from user endpoints, right? So if that user gets infected with ransomware, he's spreading across my user VLANs. He's going to eventually knock on the doors of my server VLANs. I can reduce the overall attack surface of my servers, right? I'm closing down ports that are just not needed. I'm keeping them within the server world. And I've got that compensating control for patching, because we talked about intrusion prevention and malware scanning. I put that at the edge, because let's think about it this way, right? Even if you have the most robust patching strategy, let's say you have 300 servers, 500, 1,000 servers. Or how about just like 50 servers, right? How quickly can you actually patch those servers? They're in production. They're being used for production means. There are maintenance windows. You can't just reboot these things on the fly. There's a process. you can't do that quick enough, so you need that kind of compensating control, that virtual patching capability to protect those endpoints and servers and workstations and so on before you have a chance to actually do the patch. Right, so we want to close down those doors and make it, again, need to know. Only come in here, or even if you can't close down unneeded ports yet or restrict to IPs, just the benefit of the IPS and the malware and the app control at that data center edge can be useful. Right? Small wins. Something is better than nothing. So let's take it a step further. Let's think more micro segmentation, right? So I want to protect all of my edge assets. So my servers are somewhat protected, but now again, my users, they all have green doors. They're all open. I can kind of get up and I can walk between them at will, right? So what we're looking to do is to put an enforcement point around all my user edge devices, on wired, on wireless. And it's typically, a packet filtering kind of policy, right? We're really looking to be very heavy-handed. Either you're, like a couple policies at most. And maybe one of my favorites is the, like a printer, because printers in 2019, it still might as well be, 2003 from printer technology perspective, right? Just from vulnerabilities. Many of them have web servers, many of them have vulnerabilities. Upgrading them can be a real pain. Sometimes you have to visit them manually and upgrade them. So rather than doing that, what you could do is you could push a policy, to a port, or if they're wireless, to a profile, and you can say, all right, oh, you're a printer. Let me set a policy that says only users can talk to you on the LPD port, the printer port, and the only folks that can talk to you on port 80 are maybe in the administrative subnet or something like that, right? So I've contained an overall risk. So there's a vulnerability in that web server. I don't want users accessing it to take advantage of it and do what they want in my environment. I've now just prevented the users from accessing that printer port. Another good example would be, a medical device, and a group of medical devices that need to talk back to a console. Same deal. Maybe there's only 15 of them. I have 1,000 devices on the overall network. These 15 devices need to talk to each other or just to the console. I push a policy. Maybe it's like 3 lines. You can talk to your console. No one else can talk to you. Again, making it so, it really makes it so VLANs are just a way to get onto the environment. It has nothing to do with security at that point. So we're limiting the lateral spread between users and endpoints. Like going back to ransomware, I'm going to keep going back to it. That one user clicks on it, it then spreads, right? Do my laptop's devices really need to talk to each other at all even, right? So if I think about it, either on all ports or even just file sharing, if I close some of the file sharing ports, like if I was trying to block like a WannaCry, I push a policy that says, oh, you're a production user with a production device. Okay, you actually cannot access any other users and devices, but you can go upstream. And what's upstream? An internet firewall and a data center firewall. So I have a very small policy enforcement on my actual device. And then when I go upstream to get to the real crown jewels, I have much larger enforcement points in my firewalls. And as I said, we're enabling a kind of a quick containment from an incident response perspective. So I have a containment policy essentially in play all the time. But when a bad thing happens, I just have to, I'm going to use the tool to go in and say, okay, where is this user? Where is this device? Quarantine. I pre-build all that stuff so that now I can react much quicker when something bad happens. And we're really, like that printer example or that IoT example, I'm really adding security at the network level for devices that just have no security, right? They don't have built-in firewalls and all that kind of stuff, right? So I'm using the infrastructure to do that. All right, so speaking of, how do I actually make all this stuff happen? What are some of the tools that I need and the pieces that I need for this? So I'd say the big one is your infrastructure, right? So the infrastructure plays a key role, especially at the edge, where all my users and devices are, right? Because when I think about zero trust segmentation, there are certain features and capabilities I need. 802.1x, port-based access list, net flow, unsampled at line rate, tagging technologies. A lot of the security use cases that we have require an infrastructure that supports those features, right? So if you make an infrastructure decision kind of in a silo and then you kind of come up with your security use cases, there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to support it. So I actually did have a customer recently where I mean, they had a great use case, a roadmap of use cases for security, for improving overall posture. It included segmentation, containment strategies. It was really quite robust. But when we started to talk about the infrastructure, the infrastructure was a recent RFP. It was based on price, and a lot of the features they needed just weren't capable in those switches. Line rate, net flow, et cetera. Just some of them just weren't there. .1x ACLs, et cetera. So it's very important that when we're investing in infrastructure, we kind of keep security in mind. Obviously, money is money, and we have to make compromises. But at least if we're doing that knowingly, we're not kind of caught off guard, later. Because if I have to sacrifice, I might be able to put a compensating control in somewhere else to make up for that. So probably the next most important piece is network access control. So at the edge level, NAC is really kind of the front end of this, right? Because I need to know who you are, I need to know what you are before I can really do any segmentation, right? So NAC is going to authenticate my user or my device. Then I'm going to classify it. What type of user are you? What type of device are you? And with that comes some level of authorization, right? What should you have access to? What you should not have access to? And then my enforcement, right? I'm going to leverage my infrastructure in some cases to actually do, that level of enforcement. We talked about next-gen firewall at length. I don't think I have to go into super detail on this one, but this can help us from like a macro level, data center to server. I do have some customers that have actually used next-gen firewall for their user segments, right? Don't even, it's almost like, well, I'm not just going to do it on servers, but how about just have all the users terminate on a firewall as well? That works too. Depending on your environment, that can get costly from a hardware perspective, but I've certainly seen it happen, right? And again, it's all the same reasons. The intrusion prevention, the AV, the fact that the firewall was built as a policy enforcement tool like this to begin with. Or if we're talking in the virtual world, having virtual next-gen firewalls to do macro and micro also is kind of something that's been taking off. Net flow and behavior analysis. So on the edge, right, we talked about the firewall at the macro edge. It's got great logging, but what if I'm just going between VLANs or I'm in the same VLAN, right? How do I get that east-west traffic? For me to get that visibility, I really need some type of net flow or behavior analyzer in order to get that visibility. And that visibility is going to help me, not just visibility for the sake of visibility, but also it's going to help me build policy. And then kind of finally, like we have a lot of technologies in play. Do I have a central point to send this, either for operational troubleshooting, for security investigation, a syslog aggregation point, a SIM tool, managed or not, to give you that single pane in order to kind of move in and out of these data sets? Because, I mean, depending on how serious you get, it can be cumbersome. So if we kind of get started here visually again, so from a NAC perspective, I'm really trying to bring visibility to my faceless endpoints, right? So it's not an accident that these are, faceless, neckless users here for some reason, no necks. We're really trying to, identify what they are, right? So if you look kind of in the guest column, we have those faceless users, and now I know that I've got some mobile devices, I've got laptops, I've got tablets, right? It helps me it helps me do that policy enforcement, number one, with my different technologies, but it also, this concept of only authorized users are allowed. Friend or foe is what we usually talk to it, right? It's tough for me to enforce friend or foe if I don't know, what I'm looking at, right? So the other kind of area here, I'm not sure if you caught that, I'll kind of back up for a second. We talked about the physical layer. So inside my network, I go through that lobby firewall, I'm in my VLAN, I can get up and walk down the hallways and go between my VLANs, but there's a level of physical access. So it's kind of like having a really secure office building with that front door, and there's a guard and there's a key card, and there's maybe a guy with a handgun, and there's just a lot of checks and balances right at the front door. But once you're in the environment, if I'm not locking down the physical layer, going back to the building analogy, every room in that building across the outside has a door that's not locked. So sure, I've got all that front-end security, but I can just walk up to a room, open the door, and I'm in, right? So that's another place that NAC can help, and that it kind of locks those doors to the physical layer. So regardless of where you're plugging in, it's a switch port in an operating room that's supposed to have a medical device attached. Maybe it's just a conference room. Maybe it's kind of the front lobby. I can actually control those very easily with network access control, and I don't have to really concern myself with, okay, was there ever a ticket that changed the VLAN? Is it the right VLAN anymore? And so on. And at the end of the day, we really want to turn all these faceless endpoints into devices, right? So we kind of built out our VLANs. We know what we want on them, and you can kind of see like, okay, my user VLAN, I got some laptops, but all right, I got a couple BYOD mobiles for some reason. I got my little IoT medical robot there. It's like my little IoT guy. Why is he in that VLAN? Oh, I got IP phones. What are medical devices and printers doing in the IP phone segment, right? If you don't have a tool like this, how do you really know what's on those VLANs, either from just a raw visibility or from an enforcement, right? So we really want to get control over all of that. And then we talked about kind of seeing the unseen, right, from an east-west perspective. We talked about logging capabilities, flow analytics. In order for me to do any enforcement of that segmentation, I need a context of user behavior, right? One, to help me guide policy, and then how about just visibility for the sake of visibility, right? And it helps me with my investigations and so on. And so, going back to that building, I need my surveillance cameras, like not just in the hallways, not just at the front door where I know that my next-gen firewalls have great logging capabilities, but how about in the hallways? How about in the rooms themselves, right? Users on the same VLANs, devices on the same VLANs. I want to be able to see what those users and devices are doing, regardless of whether it's east, west, north, south, this port, that port, doesn't matter. I need that visibility in order to make real decisions on what my policy should be. All right, so that's the edge. So let's talk about data center for a second, because microsegmentation in the data center has the same concept, but a different kind of execution style, right? So we have our servers and our DMZs in our internal VLANs, and we want to, again, achieve the same capability. We want to put enforcement points around all those server workloads. We want to change them from faceless endpoints to stuff that we know about. Now, in the server networks and the data center networks, we more or less have a good idea of what those servers are doing because we put them there, we installed them. But depending on the size of your organization, how much oversight is there when someone stands something up? If we stood it up as server XYZ, how do we know that it's, it used to be a web server, it used to be a database server, now it seems to be issuing web requests, right? So how do we know that the type of server hasn't changed, right? So what we're doing there, our strategy in the data center is slightly different, right? And it looks something like this at a super, super high level, right? So we're talking about private, from a private perspective, I could have physical servers, I could have hypervisors. If I'm moving towards a hybrid cloud environment, I might have Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, et cetera. So I've got workloads everywhere. Those workloads may need to talk, speak to each other across these different mediums. And if I'm starting to draw the pictures, all right, this application, this is the front end, these are the two back ends, who needs to talk to what? Okay, do these need to talk to any other applications outside of that? And this is kind of what the picture starts to look like. And in reality, really we want to get to is something more like this, where we're using kind of almost business language to create our policies. This is the point of sale, the PCI. This is a PCI segment, right? And that means we're super restricted. This is where I take credit cards. There's front ends, there's back ends, there's middleware. Those should be able to talk to each other on certain ports. They shouldn't be able to talk to any other groups, right? Or kind of my medical application, same deal, or my IoT device types. 15 devices going back to that console. That console could be a virtual machine in this environment, right? So how do I control who gets to access what? And the general idea is we want to think about it less about IP addresses, because that just can be too cumbersome. We want to think about it more from application naming. So in order to do that, I really need a specific tool set. I need a microsegmentation solution, intent-based. Another word for this, by the way, another phrase is intent-based segmentation. What's the business intent, using application words. And it's really broken out into two capabilities here. There's an agent-based approach and there's a network integration-based approach. So from an agent-based, this is kind of exactly what it sounds like. I'm deploying agents to my data center workloads. That means the workload could be virtual, could be physical, could be in the cloud. As long as I can install an agent on that OS, it's an agent-based, right? So what does the agent allows me to take control, well, there's really two ways. The agent in most solutions take control over the local either Windows firewall or IP tables in Linux. And then there is one solution that kind of does the firewalling in its own agent, but it's kind of the general idea. The enforcement is done right at that level. There's obviously some good things about that. One, I'm installed on the agent, the OS, so I'm locally process aware, which means I don't need to do deep packet inspection. I might have some encryption capabilities, again, because I'm at the endpoint level. I'm hypervisor agnostic because I'm an agent. Doesn't matter where you are. Azure, AWS, Google, physical, then VMware, Hyper-V, doesn't matter, right? It's an easy drop-in, if I'm doing an agent. So let's say I have 1,000 servers and, 20 of them are PCI. They're I take payments here. I don't want to necessarily deploy a solution out of the gate for 1,000 servers, so I did buy 20 agents. I roll it to the to those workloads. I do my policy, and now they're protected from everything else. Even though the rest of the environment isn't super protected from each other, this was my main use case, so it's an easy drop-in. And from a performance perspective, I'm just taking advantage of the capabilities already built into the OS. Cons, some people just hate agents, and you just can't get the agents deployed to those workloads. Maybe you don't have a good app or a workflow to do it. There's typically not a level of advanced inspection at agent-based. And how about just if the OS doesn't support an agent? Some of these tools you can't install on an AS400, for example. It's things like that. So that means I need an alternative strategy to enforce that policy. Now, on the flip side, we have network integration based approach. So that's kind of exactly as it sounds. So it's virtual network integration. It deploys enforcement points either to every VM host or one or two enforcement points where all VM hosts kind of move their traffic to those single enforcement points. Those enforcement options could be the next-gen firewalls we've already talked about on the edge, could be the same vendors, they're virtual. Or they could be a more dedicated microseg solution. They provide their own enforcement points, and they're all built in. The way that works, it's workload bridging. It's almost like a private VLAN where every workload has to traverse one of these enforcement points to get to every other workload, regardless of what VLAN you're in. So that's kind of the general idea of how this works. And because it's kind of an external enforcement point outside of the workload, I might have a higher level of inspection options at my disposal. So the big pro here is no agents, right? So from a visibility, I can put an enforcement point into a VM host. I can do a tap trunk. I see all the traffic. I get all the visibility. I can start to build my policy. So very, very easy to get visibility on. No, obviously, like I said, no agents. People, again, don't like agents. This is kind of the way to go. I have advanced inspection capabilities, again, because I'm a dedicated enforcement point. I'm a next-gen firewall. Cons, though, are, I might be hypervisor dependent, right? I might not be able to do or execute a solution like this on every single hypervisor. So that's important. Resource utilization could be a thing, so if I'm adding essentially virtual firewalls to my virtualized cluster, if I'm in a really good utilization point and I start adding in more inspection, maybe that means I need another compute blade. Maybe I need more storage for some of the logging, right? So you just kind of have to keep those things at the back of your mind when you're going for an approach like this. And then just what do we do for physical? So when we talked about the agent, if it's physical, no problem. I just roll the agent to a physical endpoint. When I'm doing virtual network, depending on the solution you're going with, I might need a solution that can give me an external enforcement point, but integrate into the same policy engine. So it's a con here, mainly because not all of these network-based solutions support that. So again, if you have those needs and you really like the network-based approach, you got to keep that in mind. So general common features, regardless of what tool you're looking at from a microsegmentation, is one, granular visibility, right? So the whole point here is let the tool really ingest all the data about all your east-west traffic. What you guys do is you go in and you say, here are my servers, here's what the application is, here's how they play in that application, front-end, back-end database, here's the location. You essentially assign tags, and then you let the tool do the learning. And then the tool can tell you, okay, well, I can tell that these front ends, the only apps, this is the PCI realm or whatever, and these back ends only get communications from these front ends. Okay, now I can enforce a policy that says only the front ends can talk to the back ends and so on, and only within their same group. So if the tool that you're looking at does not help you build the policy and execute the policy, then the tool shouldn't even be on the table. Or if you're looking at the tool but there's another add-on, make sure to get the add-on, right? Because a lot of tools help you with enforcement of policy, but they might not help you build the policy. And that's super critical because if you have to do this manually, I mean, it can take months or longer to do just a handful of applications. And you might spend 3 months, 6 months. By the time you maybe finish, some of the applications you started with may have changed, and now you have to go back. And again, you're doing it manually. There's no kind of, living, breathing, it figures it out on the fly type of stuff. So it's really helping you with the application dependency mapping. So no matter what tool you look at, those are kind of some of the core features. Now, depending on the solution, what's important to you from a scorecard perspective, the kind of the network-based, external enforcement points. I may have the ability to do some intrusion prevention, malware scanning. If I'm using agents, I might have local process awareness. So not only can I tell you what process is actually spinning up this traffic that may be malicious, I can also flag if it's maybe abnormal behavior for that process. Maybe this process shouldn't be doing things like this. Now, because I'm on the endpoint, I can actually do some of that. Or again, vulnerability analytics. I'm local. I'm on the machine. I see all the applications. I can actually pull into a CVE database, and now I can say, okay, this is kind of the risk footprint of this workload based on the fact that I have an agent on it, right? So anyway, lots of different capabilities here, depending on the solution. So a couple other quick questions before we wrap it up. Do you believe the decisions made regarding your infrastructure, either product or design, have put your organization in a good position to take advantage of segmentation capabilities? So was part of your success criteria security use cases when you kind of looked at the switching and the wireless and the WAN and so on? Seconds. Awesome. Great. We talked about the importance of that. And finally, do you believe your organization has room to improve security posture by leveraging either segmentation or zero trust concepts? Heck. No surprises there. So some takeaways. Wrap it up a bit. First thing, we're really nothing like super crazy from a concept perspective here. We're really continuing the strategy of defense in depth and security in layers. I think of, and we've been talking about segmentation for years now, right? And I think we're in a time where the solutions exist to actually help us do this. I think we've always had the enforcement capabilities, but what we've been lacking is, I hate to use the buzzword, but some of the machine learning capabilities to actually listen to what's happening and then recommend the policies and help you build the policies to do the enforcement. I think as those technologies have matured, we just have more capabilities now than we did. Key points, again, methods for segmentation differ, whether I'm on the edge or whether I'm in the data center. So it's there might be some integration between the two, but the overall solutions are slightly different. Key point here, right? Segmentation, we're going to limit the blast radius of threats, right? So we get that ransomware, that one user clicks on a thing. I don't want that one user to direct the place, because they made, they had an error in judgment once. I don't want to take down 1,000 machines because one user clicked the thing, right? And then, it's also enabling that containment just also out of the gate, but that kind of that incident response capability where the enforcement points are all in play, and I can, quarantine users that do have issues. Choose a solution that best fits. So we talked about, hey, agent-based versus network-based, and then depending on each solution, some tools have more extras than others, and you kind of have to just figure out what the best, from a drop-in perspective, what is the most seamless, from a cost-effective, from a hybrid cloud, does it hit all the marks for what you're looking at? And some of this stuff isn't super rocket science, but it's really just make sure your success criteria is thorough here. Make sure that the tools have the ability to help you build that dependency mapping and get the modules or the extras or whatever you need to do in order to make sure that is a key part of the solution. True of anything in the security world, start with visibility and then advance to enforcement. I mean, we do this in NAC itself, or intrusion prevention or whatever it may be, right, over the years. You always start with visibility, then you start to build your policy, you let your policy stay in monitor mode, then you do enforcement, right? You don't want any surprises. You don't want to turn on all the gadgets and push all the levers and then hope that on Monday everyone still works, right? You want to be in complete control, measure 6 times, cut once, that kind of deal. And finally, it doesn't matter, it doesn't really matter if you're healthcare, what vertical you're in, what size organization you are, if you're one small hospital, if you're a mix of hospitals, if you got a lot of small remote sites, if you're a massive organization, most of these tools will fit. There's a tool that fits, just from a management and both a financial side of things. Again, it's just going through the process, figuring out what are my important bits, how it's going to fit into my environment. So we're just about up on time, so I appreciate everyone kind of tuning in and listening. I hope everyone took something away and that was informational. If anyone has any questions, I'll kind of hang on the line for a second or two to answer any questions. If you want to have a follow-up conversation, maybe not in a public kind of setting, and you want to do something a little more personal, please reach out. We can certainly, set up a discussion to see how some of these concepts fit into your own environments. But otherwise, I appreciate the time that you guys spent. I know we kind of went all the way to the end here, but hope it was helpful, and see you next time.
All right. Well, we did not receive any questions throughout the session, so I think it's if anyone does have anything, feel free to submit it. But we'll get started wrapping up. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. Shortly after we wrap, a survey window will pop up requesting your input on today's session, as well as your interest in future topics. As a thank you for taking the time to complete the survey, we will send you a Starbucks gift card, so your next cup of joe is on us. We also encourage you to join us next month when Carousel's Director of Customer Experience Technology, Pundari Pathini, will discuss implementing digital engagement tools for an omni-channel customer experience. And with that, there are no questions, so thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.